Orbital Gardens, this is Mission Control. We are confirming acquisition of your signal. You are live in 5, 4, 3, 2.
Hello and welcome to Gardeners of the Galaxy, the podcast for all of the sentient beings in the universe who have a passion for plants. I am Emma the Space Gardener and I will be your host as we explore gardening on Earth and beyond. Throughout human history, when people have moved around the globe, they've taken their plants with them. They've carried with them the plants they relied on for food, for health, and for happiness. In some ways, plants are tailor-made for travelling. Many have seeds that can survive for years in their dry form, or that have evolved to float down rivers and across oceans. Some stick to the feet of birds, cling to the fur of animals, or fly on the wind. So some seeds travel well, but others are homebodies, so short-lived or tied to their environment that they struggle to germinate anywhere else. Live plants aren't really designed to move. They have roots that firmly anchor them to one place, but they also have a neat trick in that they can often survive being uprooted and moved to a new location. If the conditions are right there, they can grow new roots and thrive. And so gardeners move plants around from one garden to another, sharing seeds, cuttings, potted plants and bare root trees with friends and neighbours, and nurseries sell them to customers and clients both near and far. And since we're not biosecurity experts, hitchhiking plants, and other things, often catch a ride with the species we intend to transport. In this episode, I'm going to be talking about a man who had a huge impact on the way plants were transported around the globe, with far-reaching consequences he could never have imagined. First, though, I'd like to thank each and every one of you who supports the show, whether that's via a financial contribution or by sharing it with friends and colleagues. Gardeners of the Galaxy wouldn't exist without you. And if you haven't already discovered the Gardeners of the Galaxy Mission Report, it's a weekly email newsletter packed with astrobotany news and updates. To subscribe, visit theunconventionalgardener.com and click the newsletter link in the top right corner. European colonialism in particular allowed people to build fortunes, reputations and even nations by transporting plants. Wars were fought over tea. The crew of a ship laden with breadfruit trees famously mutinied, and a tree that grew in the Amazon proved to be the solution for malaria-stricken Europeans in the Indian subcontinent. The consequences of those transplants and many more are still with us today. But most of the plants that embarked on those long sea voyages didn't survive them. Packed in crates and casks, they ran the same risks as human passengers of being shipwrecked and drowned or tossed overboard by pirates. But although they didn't have to worry about scurvy, the plants were beset by a raft of other problems, including drying out from a lack of fresh water, rotting away in the darkness of the hold, being eaten by rats and mice, poisoned by salt spray, or being used as a litter box by the ship's cat. In 1819, keen horticulturalist John Livingston estimated that only around 1 in 1,000 plants collected in China survived to reach London. That means that each live plant arriving in England would have cost about £300. Scientists and horticulturalists devised ingenious methods to ensure plants survive the high seas, recommending using casks with ventilation holes, stopping over at St Helena to revitalise sickly specimens, coating roots in honey, or even burying the whole plant in mercury. What you have to remember is that at the time, they had no idea what keeps plants alive. It wasn't until the late 18th century that Joseph Priestley discovered oxygen and Dutch scientist Jan Ingenhousz discovered photosynthesis. So early attempts to keep plants alive outside of their natural environments were hit and miss. It is at this point that we meet the hero of our story. Dr. Nathaniel Ward was a medical doctor in Victorian London. From a young age, Nathaniel was a keen amateur naturalist interested in the world around him. But he wasn't born into the kind of money that lets you botanise your life away. His father was a medical doctor with a practice in Whitechapel, and so Nathaniel followed in his footsteps. Luckily for Nathaniel, and for us, until the late 19th century, medical doctors were required to study plants, which was still the source of most medications. Nathaniel was a member of the Society of Apothecaries and would have been a frequent visitor to the Chelsea Physic Garden, which still exists today. Botany was among the many exams he would have taken during his medical training. So Nathaniel had his day job as a doctor, but continued his study of the natural world as a hobby. And it was such a passion for him that he developed a network of contacts that included some of the foremost botanists and horticulturalists of the era, including Charles Darwin, Asa Gray, John Lindley, and William and Joseph Hooker. But as a keen gardener, Nathaniel had a problem. He lived in Wellclose Square, close to the London docks and surrounded by factories that belched pollution into the air. He saw the effects of the airborne toxins on his patients and found that very few plants could survive in his garden. He hit on a solution to that problem by accident. One day he decided to study the development of a moth pupa and sealed it into a bottle with a little soil and dried leaves. He kept a close eye on the developments, noting that condensation formed on the glass during the day and ran back into the soil at night. Once the moth had emerged, he opened the bottle to release it, only to find that 2 seeds had germinated and begun to grow. He resealed the bottle and placed it on the windowsill in his study, watching as the plants, a fern and a meadow grass, survived and thrived for 3 years. Sealed inside the jar, they had been protected from the noxious atmosphere outside it. With that insight in mind, Nathaniel designed a new packing case for plants, the first with a closed environment, what we now call a Wardian case. As enthusiastic as any modern plant parent, Nathaniel filled his house with Wardian cases, putting them on every windowsill and even on the roof, and he demonstrated that they allow the successful growth of all kinds of plants. And thousands of plants surrounded the house, squeezed in anywhere they would fit. The horticultural journalists of the day marvelled at this urban oasis, with John Claudius Loudon proclaiming it the most extraordinary city garden we have ever beheld. Increasingly ornate and ornamental Wardian cases, the forerunners of what we now call terrariums, would come to grace the drawing rooms of every fashionable Victorian home, propelling the British population through fern mania and into orchid delirium. But Nathaniel wasn't done. Drawing on his extensive network of contacts worldwide, he devised an audacious experiment. In 1833, he planted up 2 sturdy Wardian cases with a variety of plants. These cases were built to survive the rigours of a long ocean voyage. They were loaded onto the poop deck of the Persian, with instructions that they not be opened until they reached their destination, Sydney, Australia. Now this was no short jaunt. In fact, it was the longest voyage that could be undertaken. When the ship finally pulled into Hobart for a short stopover, Captain Charles Mallard opened the cases and took the first peek, before dashing off a quick note for Nathaniel back in England. You will, I am sure, be much pleased to hear that your experiment for the preservation of plants alive, without the necessity of water or open access to air, has fully succeeded, he wrote. He offered warm congratulations upon the success of this simple but beautiful discovery for the preservation of plants in the living state upon the longest voyage. The ship then made the final leg of its journey, with the plants unloaded in Sydney and delivered to John Maclean, assistant to the superintendent of the Sydney Botanic Garden. All but 3 plants had survived. Nathaniel had finally found the key to keeping plants alive on long voyages. In 1834, his cases were repacked with Australian plants for the return trip. Storms and salt spray battered the unattended cases. The plants had to endure tropical temperatures up to 38 Celsius and icy blasts down to -7 Celsius. Yet endure them they did. When they arrived back in London, Nathaniel opened them to discover a delicate Australian coral fern not seen before in Great Britain and in fine fettle. Because he was a member of various learned societies and otherwise well connected, Nathaniel was able to spread the news of his discovery far and wide. He gave talks, published the results of his experiments, and wrote a book called On the Growth of Plants in Closely Glazed Cases. One of his Wardian cases was even displayed at the Great Exhibition in London in 1851, where it and other marvels of Victorian ingenuity were seen by millions of visitors. The one thing he didn't do was patent his idea, so he didn't receive a penny when the Wardian case went global. At its height in the 19th century, thousands of cases were travelling around the world. They were used well into the 20th century, transporting plants for commercial and scientific purposes. Botanic gardens worldwide were well stocked due to Wardian cases. But their time came to an end. We finally caught on to the biosecurity issues of thoughtlessly carrying plants and their accompanying pests, pathogens and weeds from one place to another. We woke up to the injustice of plundering the botanical riches of one place for the economic benefit of another. And we invented air travel, allowing live plants to move around without experiencing the malaise of a long sea voyage. And so the Wardian case was abandoned. Only 15 original travelling Wardian cases survive today in museums and botanic gardens. But we've gone mad for terrariums again, so their descendants find a home in our living rooms. As gardeners of the galaxy, we're looking on as researchers send plants on ever longer journeys out towards the stars and looking forward to the day when we see them growing on the Moon and Mars. And as we do, we should spare a thought for a man who is not well remembered, but without whom none of this would be possible. Dr. Nathaniel Ward and his remarkable accidental discovery. That's it for this episode. Don't forget that you can find the show notes at theunconventionalgardener.com. Now I'll hand you back to Mission Control. Capcom, which plant would you pack in a Wardian case on the way to Mars?
Orbital Guards, this is Mission Control, confirming termination of your signal. I've thought about it, and the plant I would take to Mars would be an oak tree, because I want to breed squirrels on Mars. Mission Control out.